Hi, I'm Tristan. This is Magic Maillard Maple, and today we're thinking about the science behind bacon.
Food shots.
It's spring 2021, and with more than 24 million people having had their first dose of vaccination, the country is slowly moving out of lockdown 3. Now, because the weather's picking up, we fancy taking some more of our long country walks, and there's nothing I prefer in my packed lunch than a classic bacon, lettuce and tomato sandwich. Now, curing's perhaps one of the oldest food preservation methods known to man, although, strictly speaking, cattle slaughter would have been taking place more towards the end of autumn. So people would be taking advantage of the cooling weather to help them store the meat across the long, cold winter. But in the 21st century, meat is a 24-hour-a-day, 7 days a week business. And in the UK, about 85,000 tonnes of pork was produced just last month. So if we're going to want to put the B in our BLT, we better get started.
With pigs, sheep and cattle, there are a variety of different cuts that we can use, each with their own tenderness and flavour. Today, we're going to make both streaky bacon, which comes from pork belly, and back bacon, that's made from pork loin. To do this, we need to combine our meat with a dry cure mix comprising salt, sugar and No. 1 Prague powder. This is a good recipe, but for safety reasons, if you are going to make this yourself, be sure to follow the instructions provided by the Prague powder manufacturer. So how does the curing process increase the shelf life of pork? We have two main preservation mechanisms. Firstly, by adding sodium chloride, we will decrease the water activity of the meat. Remember, microorganisms need water to be able to grow, and just by lowering the water activity to below 0.9, we will reduce the activity of several pathogenic bacteria, and below 0.6 we will see little microbial activity at all, although these organisms may still remain viable. There are two traditional methods of curing meat. The oldest is the dry cure, where the meat is placed in direct contact with the salt mixture, and any resulting liquid is allowed to drain away. The other is brining, where the meat is immersed in a solution of salt in water. In both techniques, initially the fresh meat has a lower osmotic potential than the medium surrounding it, and water and soluble proteins will flow out from the meat. However, as salt diffuses into the muscle cells and forms complexes with the remaining proteins, the osmotic pressure within the meat can rise, and in the case of brining, we eventually see some liquid flowing back into the meat, plumping and tenderising it, yet remaining unavailable for microbial activity. By swapping some of the salt for sugar and making a sweet cure, we can improve the palatability of the final product. In our recipe, we will use a hybrid of these techniques. We start by removing the skin from the pork belly, and then we can dry blend the cure mix. We then rub the mix deep into the surface of the pork and transfer the meat and remaining dry mix to a vacuum sealed bag. After vacuum sealing, we transfer to a refrigerator at 5 degrees Celsius for 7 days, turning the pack over every day. After this, we can see that the bacon has formed its own saturated brine solution. We will wash off the residue, then pat the bacon dry. We also notice that the bacon has turned a deep red colour. This is because of our second mode of preservation, sodium nitrite. Saltpeter, known today as potassium nitrate, is an essential component of black powder. This mixture revolutionised the worlds of warfare, industry and civil engineering, but saltpeter was used in food preservation long before this most explosive application. Fresh red meat gets its coloration from oxymyoglobin. The myoglobin protein can store oxygen as a ligand at its centre, thus providing a reserve of oxygen for the muscle tissue. Oftentimes, when we see red meat sold in an airtight packet, it has turned a deep purple colour. Here we have the deoxy form of myoglobin, and this should turn bright red again on contact with the air. However, as meat ages, we form metmyoglobin, which has an unattractive grey-brown colour we associate with stale meat. Saltpeter was originally added to meat to keep it a cheerful red colour. Microorganisms in the meat would convert potassium nitrate to potassium nitrite, which is eventually transformed in turn to nitric oxide, which combines with the myoglobin to form a deep red pigment called nitrosomyoglobin. This coloration is very long lasting and upon cooking forms the pink pigment nitrosohemochrome, which is characteristic of cooked ham and bacon. It was eventually discovered that this preservative also inhibits the growth of Clostridium botulinum, perhaps the most dangerous of all food pathogens. Today, we add this material in the active nitrite form, most commonly as sodium nitrite. We must be very careful in handling this material and ensure that we only add just enough to preserve the food. According to food additive legislation at the time of recording, dry cured bacon can legally contain a maximum of just 175 milligrams of sodium or potassium nitrate per kilo of final product. This value relates to the most recent safety assessment of potassium and sodium nitrites by the European Food Safety Authority, which determined an acceptable daily intake of just 0.07 milligrams nitrite iron per kilogram body weight. Incidents of acute sodium nitrite poisoning are thankfully rare and usually occur as a result of unintentional consumption of this material in its pure form. However, nitrite can contribute to the formation of nitrous amines, both as meat cooks and in the gastrointestinal tract. As the consumption of preformed nitrous amines is associated with an elevated risk of colorectal cancers, it's important to ensure foods are formulated to allow consumers to remain at or below the calculated acceptable daily intake level. The safety of all food preservatives are regularly reassessed, taking into account new data from toxicological and epidemiological studies. Importantly, ADI applies to the chemical in question from all food and drink sources, and when usage limits are set, the typical consumption level of different food categories are taken into account. Now, practically speaking, weighing less than a gram of anything is difficult to perform accurately and repeatably without a set of professionally calibrated laboratory-grade scales. As such, butchers and home curing enthusiasts can turn to Prague powder. This is a blend of salt and a small amount of sodium nitrite, in our case 6.25% by weight. By diluting this potent preservative with salt and dyeing the mixture bright pink to prevent misidentification, we make this material much safer to handle during day-to-day food preparation. So back to our bacon. After removing the salt, we need to place the bacon back in the fridge overnight to dry off. During this time, we will form a protein-rich outer skin called a pellicle, which is especially important if we wish to smoke the bacon later. After this, I just need to slice it up, pop it into a vacuum pouch, seal and store. As I plan to use this bacon later, it should be fine to store in the freezer. However, what if I prefer smoked bacon? At the end of this process, we can take the cured meat and then cold smoke it. Here we see a diagram of a smokehouse, where smoke from a wood fire is diverted into an area containing the meat. The idea is not to cook the bacon, but to dry it out further, add a smoky flavour, and most importantly, add a protective antimicrobial coat. This process further enhances the keeping qualities of the bacon and is another example of the ancient hurdle technology, where several preservative concepts can come together. Let's see this in practice. We start with a wood fire. Different woods imbue different flavours. Apple, oak and beech are particular favourites. However, resinous woods, such as pine, should be avoided as these make a bitter smoke. Wood is largely comprised of cellulose, hemicellulose and lignan. Burning these will release a variety of caramelization and pyrolysis products that are antimicrobial, as well as volatile phenolics that have antioxidant properties, both aiding the long-term preservation of the meat. As the fire burns hotter, we will also release polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are carcinogenic compounds commonly released during the burning of organic matter. Again, there are legal limits for the levels of PAHs in foods, and the production of these compounds can also be decreased by good practice, such as restricting air to the fire to keep the temperature down.
So, having seen the whole process, I'm sure some of you are inspired to make your very own tasty bacon. However, others might be less keen. How can we balance the idea that processed meat isn't always the healthiest choice, versus the fact that we've been consuming foods like this since at least the Middle Ages? And
In my opinion, part of the answer comes down to availability. Up until quite recently in human history, plants played a much larger role in our daily diet. And certainly there's plenty of evidence to suggest that reducing consumption of red meat and processed meat can have benefits to human health as well as the wider environment. Nevertheless, everything in moderation, as they say. So we're going to take our packed lunch, some healthy dog treats, and get out and go into the fresh air. Happy spring, everyone, and see you next time.